The Faculty of Education. My name's Ann Sherman, and I'm the Dean of Faculty, and I'm really thrilled to see so many people out tonight on another snowy night. I know it's unusual to have snow. I think we've got the whole winter's worth in the last 2 weeks, haven't we? But as I say, we choose to live here, so no point complaining about it. Just make sure you have good snow tires. As we begin our sessions here in the faculty, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on Wolastoqey land. We have the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center here as part of the faculty. They're an important and integral part of our faculty, and we appreciate the support that they give us, and I think it's very important that we acknowledge whose territory we're on here, and are grateful for that sharing of the land. Tonight is a very special event. This is the fourth Ottilia Chareka Memorial Lecture that we're having, and we're thrilled to have Dr. Jennifer Tupper with us from Regina. In a minute, I'm going to call up our own Dr. Alan Sears to do a formal welcome and introduction of you, Jennifer. But I just wanted to take a moment to speak about our friend Ottilia. I want to first acknowledge that Ottilia's daughter, Patricia, is here with us tonight. Patricia is the middle daughter, as I call her. She's the third of the 5 girls, and is joining us from Dalhousie, where she's in her first year of business, Bachelor of Commerce, I guess they call it there. And Patricia has completed her high school in St. John, where I'm going to brag about her. She was the president of the student union at St. John High School, awarded a great scholarship to Dalhousie, and is doing very well in her courses. I knew Patricia as my neighbor in Antigonish, because the Chareka family just lived up around the corner from me. And I first met Ottilia, though, back in 1992, I think it was. She was here doing a DOS, the Diploma Advanced Undergraduate Studies. I'm the dean, and I never remember what it stands for. And I was here doing my Master's of Education, and we, were in courses. We met each other in different groups here. And then when I moved to St. FX later, after I had done my PhD, Alan actually reintroduced us at a conference. And Ottilia was nearing the end of her PhD, and I was the head of the department at St. FX, and was fortunate enough to be able to hire Ottilia to come to St. FX. And I was thrilled. I was reminding Patricia earlier that she called me Annie. Annie, what are we going to do today? What are we going to do? And she was the liveliest person, so full of energy and passion for social justice, for making things accessible to everyone, helping people back home in Zimbabwe. Her oldest daughter, Missy, and I have talked about the number of people that she sent shoes and shirts and pairs of pants to. I swear she clothed thousands, let alone those that she says, sent support home to for schooling. She worked with the African Nova Scotian communities in Nova Scotia, helping St. FX set up Afrocentric courses at St. FX in our BEA program that was there. She worked with First Nations communities. She did a tremendous amount of work. As Patricia could tell you, she was on the road a lot, wasn't she? And sometimes with 1 or 2 girls, sometimes alone, and just zipping home to get back to feed those girls supper. And she was an inspiration to all of us. As you know, tragically, it's been 4 years since Ottilia passed away. Her daughters, Missy, or Praymar, is now in Calgary, writing her LSATs, graduated from Mount Royal College there. Patience has just moved to Halifax, where Patricia is. She's a yoga instructor, the most fit person I've ever seen. The fourth sister, Primrose, is in her grade 12 year at King's Edgehill and has just been accepted at Queen's in engineering. And Patricia keeps reminding me she's the smartest one. She must be pretty smart because the others are very capable girls. And Priska, who I think of as the baby, but is now 7 years old, is living in Wolfville. So 4 of the girls are quite close to each other now, which is lovely. And when Primrose graduates this year from high school, all of the sisters will be able to be together, which I'm delighted to hear that tonight. And so we're really thrilled that you're here tonight, Patricia. And very, very happy to have you attend the lecture and be here representing your family. We miss Ottilia dearly. Alan was Ottilia's supervisor, and we talk often of the work we did together with her, but also just the fun that we had. Visiting each other's home, having a meal together, just the kind of support from a colleague who was also a friend. And that's what I miss the most. So I'm really glad that you're able to be here tonight to join us in honoring her memory and in her passion about social justice, about the kinds of work with marginalized groups, with people who have been treated unfairly. She was a passionate fighter for any student who might appear to be the underdog in a class, and she's really left a mark on all of us. With that, I'm going to ask Dr. Alan Steers to come forward and introduce our special guest speaker.
And the fun is what we should remember most. I think if you go outside and look at the pictures, you'll notice one where Ottilia is in a line with 3 colleagues. I took the picture. She's at CSSE, and the other 3 are all standing up straight, and she's doubled over in laughter. So it's a wonderful picture. And I do want to remind you, I'll probably forget at the end, or Anne might forget at the end, there is a reception afterwards. We can talk more downstairs in room 225. Just that way on the hallway on the next floor down. It's really my privilege to introduce Jennifer. We're old friends. I'm old anyway, and we're friends. So. Somebody asked me the other day, well, when did you meet her? And I couldn't remember, so she reminded me yesterday. We met at CSSE in Halifax when she was finishing her PhD. She was a PhD student, and Ottilia and Carla were there as PhD students. Carla Peck was the first Ottilia Chareka Memorial Lecturer, was a master's student at the time. And I followed Jennifer's work. She worked with a colleague of ours at U of A doing her PhD, George Richardson, and I followed her work since. Her first job was at University of Regina, where she stayed, and she's made a real contribution to the university and to our field. She's published widely in the area of social studies education generally, and treaty education in particular, writing with Michael Capello, who was her PhD student. She won a Canadian Association for Curriculum Studies Award for an article that they published in Curriculum Inquiry called, I just want to get the title right, Teaching Treaties as Unusual Narratives, Disrupting the Curricular Common Sense. She's been a teacher as well. She is a teacher as well. And today, this has been a long day for her. She started at 8:30 this morning with my elementary methods class, and then presented in my secondary methods class this afternoon at 2:30. So she's had the kind of day I usually have on Thursday, and we're asking her to speak again, but we're really glad to have you here. She's a great citizen of her faculty. She was associate dean, and they were short a dean, and she stepped in, and she's now an acting dean at the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. So she's made all kinds of contributions to academically and administratively and pedagogically. So Jennifer, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thanks. Well, and I want to thank all of you for braving this weather outside. And I'm from the prairies. I'm not afraid of winter, but I think I'm afraid of the snow that's falling down. We have wind chill, you have snowfall. So thank you all for coming. I know it's not always easy. to get places when the weather is like this. And I also want to say hello in Cree, so Tansi, and to again thank you for coming. And also, Patricia, it was such a privilege to have dinner with you tonight and to get to know you. You are remarkable, and your mother would be so proud of all you've accomplished already, and you're only just not quite 20, so amazing things yet to come. So I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity. It's such an honor, and I knew Ottilia. We shared similar commitments to social justice education. She's an amazing scholar, as you know, an amazing teacher, mother, and a colleague who touched the lives of those around her. So speaking here tonight is a way for me to try my best to honor her memory and to continue the work that she was so very passionate about. Her death represents not only a profound loss for all of those influenced by her work, but an imperative to confront circumstances of inequity and oppression that she works so hard to confront in her research and scholarship that affects so many people in this country and indeed around the world. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So our conversation this evening is timely and urgent. But before I begin my talk, which I've entitled Since Time Immemorial, Unpacking the Canadian Colonial Narrative Through Treaty Education, I want to also acknowledge, as Anne did, that we are gathered here tonight on Wolastoqey territory. And I also want to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 4 territory in southern Saskatchewan. The Cree, the Saulteaux, and the Assiniboine people were the original signatories of Treaty 4 in 1874 in Fort Capel, which is just outside of Regina. And it is very important for me to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 4 land. So the Treaty 4 flag hangs from our City Hall in Regina, and also at the offices of the Regina Public School Board now. And these are very recent initiatives, and they're symbolic acknowledgements of the importance of Treaty 4 to those who live, study, and work in Regina. And it took tremendous effort on the part of many dedicated individuals to see those flags hanging in those two very important places, City Hall and the school division. And I'm hoping that the university will be the next place where we hang the Treaty 4 flag. At the University of Regina, where I work, our new strategic plan is a Cree name, Peakaski Kikawano, which means we are one with Mother Earth, or the elders have said that we can also use that term to speak about being stronger together. Peakaski Kikawano, we are stronger together. So our strategic plan attempts to make central our responsibilities to collectively participate in indigenization efforts, which include being always mindful of the land that we are on, treaty land in Regina, land occupied by the First Peoples since time immemorial. And I also want to acknowledge the First Nations elders, knowledge keepers, and teachers who I have learned from on my own treaty education journey. And I was sharing with the students this morning and this afternoon that this is a new journey for me as well. When I came to the University of Regina in 2004, I didn't have the first idea of what treaty education was. And I didn't know anything about the number of treaties, even though I had been a social studies teacher for many years in Alberta, in Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 land. It wasn't part of my repertoire of knowledge. So the people specifically that I want to acknowledge are Elder Betty McKenna, who was my first teacher on this journey, Elder Noel Starkblanket, who's the elder in residence at the University of Regina, and especially storyteller and Cree knowledge keeper, Joseph Netaho, who has been a tremendous and very patient teacher as I muddle through and make many mistakes along the way. So I don't offer these acknowledgements in a superficial way. Rather, I offer them as an ongoing reminder of the burden of colonialism that we all carry with us. It's on our shoulders, of the imperative to recognize how my own white settler privilege is directly tied to the signing of the numbered treaties, particularly as the treaties made available vast tracts of land to be settled by Europeans in Western Canada, including by my own ancestors. So as such, my children, I have two daughters, 6 and 12, benefit every day from these living agreements and our historical and contemporary relationships with the First Peoples of this land. However, it's only in the last 10 years that I've come to more fully understand the foundational significance of treaties and the treaty relationship for all of us in this country, regardless of where we live. Whether we live on land that was ceded through the signing of the numbered treaties 1 through 10, or here in New Brunswick, where there are peace and friendship agreements in place since the 1700s, or even provinces like British Columbia, where the land has not been ceded through treaty, and there are negotiations ongoing right now. So the foundational importance of treaties is one of the paradoxes of Canadian history, according to historian J.R. Miller from the University of Saskatchewan. He says, treaties are one of the paradoxes of Canadian history. Although they have been an important feature of the country since the earliest days, relatively few Canadians understand what they are or the role they have played in the country's past. And I certainly was guilty of not having any knowledge about the treaties for a very long time. So I'll speak further about this colonial blind ignorance later in my talk. But first, there's an urgency to confront colonialism as it's manifest in the contemporary Canadian context, and especially as it's reproduced in and through classrooms and curriculum in schools across the country. According to Vercini, colonialism requires two fundamental and necessary components: unoriginal displacement and unequal relations. Colonialism has historically worked to produce abnormal relationships resulting from what Pratt would describe as lack of reciprocity, disequilibrium of power, the use of force by an outside agent, and the interruption of social, economic, and institutional development. Settler society, as Shireen Razak describes it, has been established by Europeans on non-European soil. Its origins lie in the dispossession and near extermination of indigenous populations by conquering Europeans. It is the specific formation of colonialism in which the colonizer comes to stay, making himself the sovereign and the arbiter of citizenship, civility, and knowing. And that's a quote from Eve Tuck, who I noticed had been here speaking recently, and whose scholarship I learned a great deal from. So I'm grateful for her work. Canada has a long and well-documented history of unequal colonial relations, specifically with the First Peoples of this land. Very recently, Perry Bellegarde, who is the new chief of the Assembly of First Nations, the former chief of the Saskatchewan Federation of Indian Nations, and longtime champion of treaty education in Saskatchewan, stated, quote, "Colonialism didn't just impact Aboriginal people. It forever changed the way the European population on the prairies would see Aboriginal peoples as a problem, never a partner." This perception is not unique to the prairies, I argue. Colonialism's reach is far and wide and deep in this country. Despite this, and I shared this with the students earlier today, our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, stated publicly at the G20 summit in 2009 that Canada, quote, "has no history of colonialism." Yeah. So this denial makes it more difficult to actively and intentionally address the structural violence based on socioeconomic inequities and racism that Aboriginal peoples throughout Canada continue to face daily. And I want to also say that the statement comes a year after his public apology for residential schools. So you see the disconnect. So such claims as these, Canada has no history of colonialism, offer a whitewashing of the foundational imperialist invasion upon which the nation is predicated, dismissing the many very real ways that Aboriginal people have been and continue to be deeply harmed by colonial policies in this country, including those which undermine the spirit and intent of the numbered treaties signed between the First Nations people and the British Crown that allowed for the settling of the West and for Canada's continued economic prosperity. The statement that Canada has no history of colonialism, I'm really going to melt this, reflects the normalized historical consciousness, that is the collective memory of Canada's past and the ways in which individual Canadians come to know and make sense of the past. There are many people in Regina who would articulate the same as Stephen Harper. Colonialism? We don't have that. That never happened here. But it ignores historical relationships with Aboriginal peoples in Canada that have been formed through the significance of the land. It's easier in many respects for Canadians to subscribe to the pioneer homesteading narrative. The land was mostly empty. The pioneers came, they worked hard, they made something of their lives, and they helped to build this great nation of ours. We have them to thank. So I want to share the words from the speech from the throne in the fall 2003 that reinforce this myth. Governor General David Johnston said in his speech, "Canada is a country founded through the courage and audacity of the pioneers who conquered geographic, military, and economic challenges, for they dared to seize the moment that history offered. Pioneers, then few in number, reached across a vast continent. They forged an independent country where none would have otherwise existed." Speech from the throne, 2003. 2013, even worse. 2013. This is the very same narrative that is ubiquitous in school curriculum across the country, and in many classroom conversations that I have participated in, both at the university and in K-12 throughout Saskatchewan. It's the narrative I learned as a child, and the very narrative I reproduced as a beginning teacher also. Is it any wonder why many Canadians do not think of this country as colonial, when that's the narrative that's being reproduced? Is it any wonder that Stephen Harper made the claims he did in 2009? These claims protect settler Canadians from having to face uncomfortable historical knowledge, from the need to consider our responsibilities to work toward reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. The denial of colonialism affirms settler consciousness, mediating relationships with and perceptions of Aboriginal peoples in a variety of contexts. Yet, as Aboriginal scholar Dwayne Donald suggests, we must be attentive to an ethic of historical consciousness. This ethic holds that the past occurs simultaneously in the present and influences how we conceptualize the future. It requires that we see ourselves related to and implicated in the lives of those who have gone before us and those yet to come. It is an ethical imperative to recognize the significance of the relationships we have with others, how our histories and experiences are layered and position us in relation to each other, and how our futures are similarly tied together. So I'd like to take a moment now to contextualize the rest of the talk within the contemporary colonial landscape of Aboriginal Canadian relations. There are so many examples I could have used, and I really thought long and hard about which ones specifically I wanted to bring into the talk tonight. You know, all I need to do in Regina every day is just open the newspaper, turn on the radio. There are so many examples. Here's, oh, just a minute. Went too fast. Nope, I missed a slide that I wanted to have there. Okay, so imagine that there is an image of the Maclean's magazine article that was published a few weeks ago that names Winnipeg as the most racist city in Canada. Okay, so that would be one example. But I want to highlight our government's lack of response to the ongoing murders and disappearances of Aboriginal women in this country. That's one example that I'll talk about. I also want to speak about a controversy that occurred locally in Saskatchewan. I'm not sure if its reach was beyond the province, but it's something that we refer to as the Got Land, Thank an Indian controversy. Is that familiar to anyone? Okay, I'll talk more about it. And I also want to speak about the Idle No More movement. Each of these examples are illustrative of the imperatives of treaty education, particularly as a means of shifting the consciousness of Canadians and for considering the ways in which colonial thinking continues to undermine and further erode relationships with Aboriginal peoples in this country. So in 2004, when I first started teaching at the University of Regina, Amnesty International published their report, Stolen Sisters, which repeatedly highlighted the complicity of government and law enforcement officials in the ongoing murders and disappearances of Aboriginal women. And for a long time, there was no response to that report officially by government. And contained in the pages of that report was information about the 1996 murder of Pamela George. So she was a 28-year-old Aboriginal woman in Regina, the mother of 2 young boys, who, because of her circumstances, found herself working in the sex trade. She was brutally murdered by 2 white male University of Regina students, one of whom was enrolled in my faculty, in the Faculty of Education, with aspirations to become a teacher. Oh, sorry, there's the Maclean's article, yeah. So that's a picture of Pamela George. before she was murdered. The Faculty of Education student, Stephen Comerfield, bragged about what he'd done with his classmates. He was charged with murder and tried by judge and jury along with a fellow student. But prior to the jury's deliberation, they were advised by the judge, Ted Malone, to consider that Pamela was engaged in high-risk behavior, that she was indeed a prostitute, when considering whether she had consented to sexual assault, which in turn would inform whether the men were convicted of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. So her circumstances had some kind of bearing on whether it was first-degree murder or manslaughter. So I just want to also add, and this is not easy to talk about, that she was so brutally beaten by these two white settler men that her family could not have an open casket at her funeral. She was almost unrecognizable. It's also important to highlight that when she was picked up the evening of her murder, one of the men was hiding in the trunk of the car so that she would not know there was two of them. And they were not convicted of first-degree murder. They were convicted of manslaughter. One of the men was paroled after serving less than 4 years of his sentence. There are so many other examples I could use to highlight the ways in which Aboriginal women throughout the country continue to be positioned as less than human, and as such would suggest that this positioning is directly connected to the ongoing processes of colonialism and racism in this country that we need to talk about and we need to tackle head on, even though they are difficult conversations to have. The government's refusal to launch a national inquiry, despite repeated requests from Aboriginal leaders across the country, is telling. And almost every Aboriginal woman I know in my work and in my life in Regina has been affected by the murder or the disappearance of a family member or a friend. So the reach is far and wide. So I'll shift a little bit, and I want to talk about the Gotland Thankin Indian issue. So this is Tanel Starr, and she was a student she's from Star Blanket First Nation, just outside of Balgonie, Saskatchewan, near to Regina. And in January 2014, so just over a year ago, when she was 13, she wore a sweatshirt to school on the first day back from her Christmas break. And on the front were the words, as you can see, Gotland, and on the back, Thankin Indian. It's a political statement she's making. She was asked by teachers at her school to remove the sweatshirt because some of her classmates complained that they found it offensive. So some of her classmates found it offensive. Some of her white classmates found it offensive. They were unsettled by it. As you might expect, this situation generated media attention and public discussion. And by the way, I own a sweatshirt too, so I almost wore it tonight. While there were many supportive comments made in online spaces, there were many negative responses that reflect an ongoing ignorance about treaties, the treaty relationship, and contemporary treaty issues in Saskatchewan and beyond. So recently, a classroom teacher with connections to the school, who I know quite well, shared with me that some parent members of the school community council at Tanel School discussed responding to the message by creating a counter t-shirt that said, quote, "Like progress, thank a white person." So as you might imagine, Tanel had to take down her Facebook page because she was inundated with hateful and racist attacks. Despite this, she continued to speak out about the importance of wearing the shirt and the meaning behind the words. She commented to a CBC reporter, "It supports our treaty and land rights. It's important." I think we can all learn something from this 13-year-old girl, and I applaud the classroom teachers who did see it as an opportunity and a means through which to take up treaty education in their classrooms, to engage their students in a different narrative of Canada's past. What really is the meaning behind the sweatshirt? Let's talk about what those words mean. To explore with students the significance of the land in the context of our treaty relationships and our treaty failures. So the Idle No More movement also represents an opportunity to consider the significance of the treaties. It began in Saskatchewan in late 2012 when 4 women, 3 Aboriginal and 1 white settler ally, Sheila McLean, Nina Wilson, Sylvia McAdam, and Jessica Gordon began to exchange emails about the Conservative government's omnibus budget bill C-45. So specifically, they shared with one another their concerns that the bill further threatened the spirit and intent of the treaties. The already fragile treaty relationship, established in and through the numbered treaties, was perceived to be even more precarious in light of the terms of this bill. Over 400 pages in length, the bill altered the legislation contained in 64 acts or regulations. Of greatest concern to the women at the time were the changes to the Indian Act, the Navigation Protection Act, and the Environmental Assessment Act. Under the changes to the Navigation Protection Act, major pipelines and power line projects have no requirement to provide assurances that the projects will not damage or destroy navigable waterways they cross, unless the waterways included on a list of waterways prepared by the Transportation Minister. With respect to changes in the Environmental Assessment Act, the number of projects requiring an environmental assessment was reduced, and the approval process made faster. So not only were these 4 women concerned about the changes to the various acts contained in the bill, they were deeply troubled by what they perceived to be a complete lack of consultation with First Nations people across the country. As such, they determined that they could not be silent, nor could they be idle, hence, idle no more. So they recognized the importance of raising local and national awareness of the terms of the bill and taking widespread action to protest these terms as a form of civic dissent. According to the official website of Idle No More, the impetus for the movement, quote, lies in a centuries-old resistance as Indigenous nations and their lands suffered the impacts of exploration, invasion, and colonization. Idle No More seeks to assert Indigenous inherent rights to sovereignty and reinstate traditional laws and nation-to-nation treaties by protecting the lands and waters from corporate destruction. Each day that Indigenous rights are not honored or fulfilled, inequality between Indigenous peoples and the settler society grows, end quote. And that's right on their website. The movement quickly became one of the largest movements in Canadian history, and it swept across the world, in fact. Not surprisingly, the response again of Canadians was mixed. While many chose to stand in solidarity with their Aboriginal brothers and sisters, others took the opportunity to make derogatory and inflammatory statements about the movement, and more specifically about Aboriginal peoples. This is not an uncommon settler response to Aboriginal assertions of treaty rights, particularly when so many of us are not engaged in our own considerations of colonialism and how we are implicated in it. As a result of my own journey to learn about and understand treaties and the treaty relationship, I do describe myself as a white settler Canadian. I wouldn't have described myself that way 10 years ago, but I do now. Recognizing the material benefits I enjoy every day as a result of this identity position, and how these benefits can be traced to colonization and the displacement of Indigenous peoples. In his research and scholarship, Adam Barker explores the roles of settler peoples in ongoing colonization through public consent and active participation. He suggests that the term settler is a statement of situation, but that settlers can and do act in non-colonial ways. In my own teaching, scholarship, and research, my use of the term settler is deliberate, in that I'm attempting to describe the historical foundations of Canada following European imperialism and the ways in which colonialism continues to shape the contemporary landscape of this country, our contemporary social, political, and economic realities. I use the term settler in an effort to challenge how my students and I think about ourselves as Canadian citizens, encouraging a deeper consideration of our historical and contemporary relationships alongside and with Aboriginal peoples, so that we may form new narratives which include considerations of settler colonialism and the ongoing violence done to Aboriginal peoples in this country. However, as I mentioned earlier, I learned a particular narrative of this country when I was in school, and I also was invited into a particular narrative through the stories that I was told growing up on the prairies that didn't include considerations of the treaties and our relationship to the land through the signing of the numbered treaties. So my grandfather was a professor of economics at the University of Saskatchewan from 1930 until his death in 1966. And he wrote about the prairie agricultural economy and the value of farming to the Canadian state. And we're really proud of the work that he did. But my grandmother shared stories of her pioneering parents that embodied the values of hard work and courage. But absent from our family narrative was any acknowledgement that the land we felt deeply connected to came to us because of the displacement of Aboriginal peoples on the prairies. While it's not my intent to claim to know the experiences of others, I suspect that the stories I was told growing up mirror stories told to other white settler children about their family histories, especially in light of official stories of Canada that have not included Indigenous knowledge systems, values, and historical perspectives. Indigenous scholar and educator Susan Dion writes, quote, "Stories that dominate Canadian history reflect an unwillingness and inability to come to terms with the reality of Canada's relationship with Aboriginal people," end quote. And this was certainly borne out in historical narratives of my family growing up. In 2008, John Ralston Saul, one of Canada's most preeminent public intellectuals, published A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada. And in the book, he asks, why do we continue to stumble and resist and deny when it comes to the Aboriginal role in Canada? The most obvious answer is that we don't know what to do with the least palatable part of the settler story. We wanted the land, it belonged to someone else, we took it. We then dressed up our right to this land along with our shoddy disrespect for the treaties and a heartfelt conviction that the original owners were dying off. This is the settler historical consciousness that allows us to embrace the pioneer homesteader narrative rather than to trouble it. It is integrally connected to the ways in which colonial processes continue to shape our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with Aboriginal peoples. A colleague of mine, Andrea Sturzik, suggests that settler identities depend on colonial discourses that reproduce forgetfulness about the past. Aboriginal scholar Dolores Calderon illustrates how such colonial ontologies are perpetuated through what she refers to as colonial blind discourses, which have been normalized for so long and are in fact a functional component of identity and nation building. Settler identities are able to remain stable through the production of ignorance, even though such ignorance is often in contradiction to the information available to us. We dismiss new narratives of the past, rationalize current inequities, and participate in blaming Aboriginal people for their current circumstances. We have many strategies to protect our settler identities. The assertion that Canada has no history of colonialism, there it is again, is a salient example of the actualization of colonial blind discourses as they work to sustain settler ignorance. So too are some of the responses to the Idle No More movement or the Got Land, Think an Indian sweatshirt worn by Chanel Star, and even in the Maclean's magazine article. At the beginning of his 2014 book, The Comeback, which I just finished reading and would recommend to all of you here, John Ralston Saul writes, "History both constrains us and demands of us a great deal. Most of the time we can't see its shape and instead feel ourselves caught up in mysterious tides, unable to make out the great flow. Or perhaps we just don't want to." So these assertions in both 2008 and in 2014 that Ralston Saul made reveal the ways in which dominant Canadians today, myself included, are implicated in colonialism through our processes of denial, dismissal, and ignorance. While there are broader socio-political considerations at play in this colonial project, for the remainder of my discussion, I want to focus on the role that education has played and continues to play in fostering or undermining relationships with First Nations people. So I want to share with you the words of Harold Johnson, who's a First Nations Cree lawyer in Saskatchewan, and he published a book in 2007 called Two Families, Treaty and Government. And writing to Kisiwamaniwak, the white cousin, he states, "The only coherent theory of your family's acquisition of sovereignty in this territory is that my family gave it to you at treaty. Your sovereignty is a treaty right. The treaties are forever. We cannot change them because the promises were made, not just between your family and mine, but between your family and mine and the Creator. There were three parties at the treaty. When my family adopted your family, we became relatives, and that cannot be undone. A bond far stronger than any contractual obligation holds us together. Your law of contract and treaty allows for breach and remedy. The Creator's law does not allow for any breach whatsoever. Failure to comply has consequences, and no matter how severe the failure, the promise never becomes null and void. The consequences just keep getting greater and greater." So in light of this, there are several imperatives of treaty education for all Canadians, which include but are not limited to correcting the dominant narrative of Canada, shifting the historical consciousness of Canadians, confronting the ongoing processes of colonialism that continues to shape Aboriginal Canadian relations, and learning to live together in the midst of difficult histories. Because of the historical and contemporary importance of treaties and the treaty relationship to the people of Saskatchewan, and as you can see, Saskatchewan is entirely covered, like Manitoba and Alberta, by a number of treaties. The provincial government announced mandatory treaty education for all students in our province. To be clear, the mandate came after many, many years of hard work on the part of the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatoon, alongside teachers, educating them about the foundational importance of treaties and the treaty relationship, and helping them to think through how this knowledge might be integrated into classrooms throughout the province. So the work of treaty education had begun long before it was made mandatory by the provincial government, but the mandate has certainly helped to strengthen the importance and the urgency of this work in much broader and sustained ways. In many respects, the mandate reflects Susan Dion's call to nurture awareness amongst Canadians of the stories of Aboriginal people in order to begin cultivating more equitable and ethical relationships. It also helps us in teacher education to support our students in actualizing treaty education in the classroom, because it is a mandate. They are contractually obligated as employees of the province to deliver treaty education. So in order to support classroom teachers, after the mandate was announced, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner responded by creating what they call Treaty Essential Learnings. And there are corresponding resources for each grade level, K through 12, and it is to be implemented in every subject area: math, health, physics, chemistry, biology, social studies, English language arts, every subject, every grade. It's the first initiative of its kind in Canada, with significant implications for education in all provinces. The Treaty Essential Learnings make explicit what students should know and understand about treaties, the treaty relationship, the historical context of treaties, First Nations worldviews, symbolism in treaty making, and contemporary treaty issues. They include in-depth teachings about the historical relationship with First Nations people, including the Indian Act, and the many other failures to uphold the spirit and intent of the treaties. Begins in kindergarten as students explore the diversity of First Nations peoples, traditional First Nations teachings like the Circle of Life and the Four Directions, and pre-contact life for First Nations people. Students also learn that the treaty is more than a promise, because they were solemn agreements between nations to share the land with the Creator as witness, and were meant to last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. And let me tell you that grade 1 students get the concept of promise, and they get the consequences of a broken promise. These are not difficult conversations to have with children, and they also understand what telling the truth means. Okay? So as students progress through the grades, they continue to learn about the significance of treaties and the treaty relationship, and the many failures of the Canadian government to uphold the spirit and intent of the treaties. So in grade 3, students explore the benefits of treaties to both First Nations and non-First Nations people. And in grade 4, they learn about unfulfilled treaty promises, especially in light of the passage of the Indian Act in 1876, 2 years after the signing of Treaty 4 in Fort Capel in southern Saskatchewan, which then regulated and controlled many aspects of First Nations lives across Canada. The learnings support an examination of contemporary treaty issues in grades 6 and 7, including land claim settlements, the duty to consult, and the differential funding of First Nations and provincial schools, which is widespread across this country and so significant in Saskatchewan. I was telling the students this morning that my daughters attend French immersion. So the per pupil funding for provincial French immersion students in Saskatchewan is $18,000, and the funding for an on-reserve First Nations child is $6,000. That is a significant disparity. It's significant. I also shared with the students this morning and this afternoon that blame and shame and guilt are not the goals of treaty education Although this is certainly how some students and teachers feel as they encounter the material for the first time. Rather, treaty education is about fostering a sense of shared responsibility to imagine a better way forward. So it's not about blame and shame, it's about responsibility, and that is a very important message that we try to articulate with our own teacher education students, who often do respond with guilt and embarrassment, and they're horrified that this is information that they're only just encountering now for the first time, and they feel bad about it. And we explain to them that they've been structurally denied the opportunity to learn about it because the curriculum in schools in K-12, for the most part, has been very one-sided in terms of the narratives of Canadian history that are presented. So in our teacher education program at the U of R, we are attempting to support students in taking up treaty education in their school placements, and of course when they have their own classrooms. They all participate in a 2-day treaty workshop that is facilitated by the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, and that provides them with opportunities to learn from and alongside elders. They also we also endeavor to integrate treaty education into many of our required core studies classes. The ability to engage in treaty education is also an evaluative outcome of our internship IPPs, the forms that teachers fill out as a means of assessing teacher candidates' internship experience. In the classes that I teach, I approach treaty education as an opportunity for the students and for me to reconsider our understanding of the history of the province and the country in light of treaties and the treaty relationship. So as such, treaty education is anti-colonial. I do want to tell you that sometimes the IPPs come back and the teachers will check not applicable for treaty education. So they do not provide an assessment for our students. So that sends particular messages. So I want to share a more specific example of treaty education as anti-colonial. When students learn about the treaty right to education and the ways in which the Indian Act undermined this right, especially through a system of residential schools intended to destroy Aboriginal culture and language, students, I think, in my experience, come to understand and appreciate a more urgent need for reconciliation work. Teaching residential schools helps to contextualize for students some of the contemporary challenges that we continue to face and that Aboriginal peoples continue to face. So 2 years ago, I was teaching a third-year education social studies class, and the students and I partnered with a group of grade 12 students in the city and their teacher to take up Project of Heart, which is a residential school inquiry project. It was created by a graduate student at the University of Regina who is a classroom teacher in Ottawa, Sylvia Smith, and she has done some amazing work educating and supporting the education of young people throughout the country and community organizations as well with respect to residential schooling. I should also tell you that I got a call from Sylvia in the fall letting me know that her federal funding was pulled for the project. And so she was looking to our faculty to provide some support for the regional Project of Heart. So that's yet another example of colonialism, right? When the funding is pulled from these sorts of important projects. So we took Project of Heart up in the context of treaty education. It involves diving into the histories that allowed for the policy of cultural genocide to be enacted in Canada. It requires painting tiles to commemorate the lives lost at residential schools, inviting a residential school survivor to speak about his or her experiences, and finally participating in a smudging ceremony of the tiles. So in this particular picture, the grade 12 students and the university students were just outside on the second floor roof of the education building, and that's Joseph Netaho, who I acknowledged at the beginning of my talk, and he is doing a smudge with the students, and they are all holding the tiles that they have just painted, and then following the smudge, he sang and drummed, and we participated in a round dance collectively as an act of reconciliation. So there were moments throughout the project when students demonstrated colonial dispositions through their misunderstandings about the history of residential schools. In some instances, my students and the grade 12s seemed to want to minimize the intergenerational trauma resulting from the residential school experiences. They wondered why Aboriginal peoples couldn't just get over it, especially because a public apology had been made by the Prime Minister in 2008. And also because by the time that we engaged in Project of Heart, Many residential school survivors had received their settlement claims as well, so wasn't it time for them to get over it? At other times, they wanted to explore the positive experiences of students who attended residential schools. And while it is important to recognize that not all students who attended residential schools were subjected to physical or sexual abuse, overwhelmingly, survivor testimonies revealed trauma and hurt. The efforts of some of my students, some of the time, to frame the conversations about residential schools in more positive ways makes sense if read through the lens of colonialism. For all of the students involved, however, Project of Heart opened up a space to think together about the historical and contemporary significance of residential schools as a part of the larger colonial project, and also as an example of how the spirit and intent of the numbered treaties were undermined through the passage of the Indian Act, which paved the way for the system of residential schools in Canada. So here are the tiles, some of the tiles that the students painted. So as an example of how treaty education might be taken up in classrooms across the country, this inquiry project helped us to begin thinking deeply about the lasting implications of the treaty failures. We confronted colonial narratives through the resources, which included the voices and experiences of First Nations people in Saskatchewan, primary source documents, and pedagogical approaches that incorporated First Nations knowledge and perspectives. And I would say for my students, probably one of the most powerful aspects of Project of Heart was listening to Joseph tell his story and getting to know him through that process. The treaty essential learnings and corresponding content support the telling of a different version of Canada's past. They support the ethic of historical consciousness advanced by Dwayne Donald that I described earlier. They challenge common misperceptions about treaties, including First Nations people as the primary beneficiaries of treaties, through such conditions as free post-secondary education and exemption from taxation, both not entirely accurate, but so often offered up by settler Canadians as the truth. The historical and contemporary perspectives of Aboriginal people and ways of knowing challenge dominant narratives of the past and currently held stereotypes of Aboriginal people. They illustrate that Canada not only has a history of colonialism, but that colonialism continues to play out every day in this country for Aboriginal peoples. Like the treaties themselves, the treaty education is a bridge to the future. So earlier in my talk, I discussed Calderon's notion of colonial blind ignorance, which remains a significant challenge to the wide-scale implementation of treaty education in Saskatchewan. Remember, I talked about the teachers who checked NA, not applicable, for treaty education. Some teachers approach treaty education in an informational way only, choosing, for example, just to teach the content of Treaty 4 as a means of fulfilling the mandate. There are those educators who believe that treaty education is for Aboriginal learners only. Others make assumptions that the primary goal of treaty education is to teach about Aboriginal cultures, and as such, they argue that they cannot take it up because they do not have a strong enough content or cultural knowledge base. However, rather than seeking out the necessary supports, as they would if they were being asked to teach another subject somewhat outside their comfort zone, they choose to ignore the mandate altogether. This year, in the K-8 school that my daughters attend, treaty education has been taken up superficially and very problematically in a half-day integration format with activities such as, and I am not making this up, First Nations word searches, myths and coloring sheets, and also those little fortune tellers, you know, that the kids like to make. Absolutely a case of good pedagogical intentions gone terribly wrong. The activities were so decontextualized that my 12-year-old daughter pointed out to me when she came home from school on that day, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm trying to honor her words. Mama, they might make the kids at my school stereotype First Nations people even more, and that's not good. So I did contact the Aboriginal Education Consultant for Regina Public, and she is working with the staff at the school to think differently about how they might integrate treaty education. Because at this stage in Ayla's schooling, grade 7, she should have had sustained treaty education for the last 7 years, right? She should know more than I know, and that's not been the case. So overall, in the last 7 years in Saskatchewan schools, the response of educators to this curricular mandate has often been superficial, unhurried, or dismissed altogether. Yet, I want to offer that there are many educators in Saskatchewan committed to actualizing treaty education. So I don't want to paint a completely bleak picture of what is happening in our province. And they are seeking out a variety of supports to do so. And they are finding communities of practice where they can engage collaboratively in this work and support one another. They recognize that as a province and a nation, we cannot continue as we have, that the work of reconciliation is paramount. So I want to share with you the words of one of these teachers who I came to know through a treaty education research project we both participated in. And this is what she offers. I realized that I was not, nor could I easily become an expert on treaties. That was the simple truth. The challenge then became how to offer a treaty education program, knowing next to nothing about treaties and the treaty relationship. The path forward, however, was quite simple. I needed to become a learner alongside my students. So I began the year admitting to my class my lack of expertise in this area and presenting them with a question: what does it mean to be a treaty person? One of the many gifts of the treaty education program is that it provides a space and a structure for the discussion of ideas. Furthermore, these ideas tend to center on questions of identity and belonging, something to which students naturally gravitate. With our current data-centered focus in education, sometimes we forget about ideas. And yet I have found that what students appreciate most is the sharing and developing of ideas, or as one student has put it, these life lessons. I asked some of my students who participated what they thought of our treaty education program. Anna, 9 years old, went away and took 2 pages to answer me. In short, this is what she said. I don't know why any teacher would not teach their students treaty education in Canada, where treaties are a big problem because the government didn't keep their promises. I was inspired by the treaties. I like to think about what could have happened differently. I find that it is not as useless as fractions. It's more of a life lesson, something to hold on to. Not that fractions are useless. Just that treaty education is not as useless as fractions. So Ellie, also 9 years old, wrote the following. Since many people don't know about treaties, it's important for people to respect treaties. Everyone must know that treaties were signed. The treaty was a promise, and it's important for everyone to learn about how Aboriginal people were on the land first. Teachers must teach us so we know our history, so when we are older, we will know more and things will be better. 9 years old, words of wisdom. So Claire, the teacher, goes on to write, one of the pedagogical lessons that I learned as a part of this project was to step back. So often classrooms are really all about the teacher, and mine had been no different. Now suddenly I wasn't the expert. It wasn't about what I wanted to teach, but what my students wanted to learn. And my students did want to learn about the treaties. Many teachers avoid teaching treaty education for a whole host of reasons, one of them being that they're afraid that their students will find it boring. In my experience, students are eager to learn about treaties because it affects them right now. They are on this land. They are bound by this treaty. They want to know why and how and what comes next. So in 2014, Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada relocated their offices from the First Nations University of Canada, which is located on Treaty 4 land in very close proximity to the main campus at U of R. I can see First Nations University out to my window. And shortly after their move, a number of commemorative treaty medals, so this is the treaty medal, and there were a number of commemorative medals made following the signing of the number of treaties. Many of these medals were found in a dumpster behind the university after Aboriginal Affairs moved out of First Nations University. The irony of this was not lost on First Nations communities and their allies. The act of casting aside the treaty medals, which depict a handshake between a First Nations chief and government agent, is symbolic of the historical and contemporary tensions between Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian government. I offer the example to further highlight the ubiquity of colonialism today and the value of treaty education to speak back to colonialism, to reshape the stories we tell as Canadians, to craft a new narrative. So last week in Saskatchewan, I was sharing with Anne and Patricia, there was a terrible car crash on Highway 6 just outside of Regina. Kind of conditions like this, a lot of snow and a lot of wind, and you know the prairies, right? And you lose visibility. So 5 individuals were killed, and 4 of the individuals were driving together in one car. including local artist Michelle Serrada and Lacey Morin-Desjardins, a beautiful powwow dancer who was teaching at the University of Regina and was so involved in community in our city. But also First Nations academic, teacher, and elder Narcisse Blood from Southern Alberta, someone I've had the opportunity to learn from on my treaty journey. They were on their way to Piapop First Nation School to continue a creative project they had begun with the students in the fall. In a newspaper article published 2 days after the crash, the incredible lives of each of these individuals was honored. What I was struck by in reading the article was the words Elder Blood shared in the context of his participation in the Making of Treaty 7 project, which he described as a healing project. He stated, "Canada is very young, and so that is the challenge. As a very young country, does it have the maturity to be able to look at itself in the mirror?" Yes, as a nation, we are young, but we need to look at ourselves in the mirror. And I believe we have the maturity to do so. We need to see the many ways in which colonialism and racism stare back at us. But we also need to see the power of initiatives such as treaty education and the hope that they offer for reconciliation. So in closing, let us all resolve to make treaties and the treaty relationship a central consideration in curriculum, classrooms, and teaching across the country. Let us always be aware of and deeply consider the effects of ongoing colonialism and racism for Aboriginal peoples, and consider our own responsibilities in working against these systems and structures. And let us be ever mindful of the power of dominant narratives to shape the historical consciousness of Canadians. Treaty education offers productive and interrogative opportunities for coming to know Canada, past and present, differently, and for imagining a better, more ethical way forward. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We do have a couple of minutes for questions or comments. Anybody? Linda.
Thank you very much. The examples that you were so powerful. I'm just thinking about before I came here tonight, even just the discussion on the TV about the new anti-terrorist, so-called anti-terrorist bill. I mean, that would shut down all of the island more, it would do everything, you know, so it's just another way of this kind of colonial narrative continuing.
Exactly, and the challenges of actively working against it, right? And there will be more examples, and that's the unfortunate.
All the time continuing.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part. And I was sharing with the students earlier today that I turned on CBC Radio at noon the other day in Regina. There's a local program called Blue Sky, and they were interviewing a woman, an Aboriginal First Nations person in Regina whose son plays minor hockey, and she was filing a complaint with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Tribunal because she felt that the Minor Hockey Association had not taken her complaint seriously. Her 10-year-old child had been called Dirty Indian by players on the opposing team and their parents. And so, you know, there you go, right? Another example, that's a more localized example, that's not policy example, but
deeply embedded in the government of the country.
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just today I had lunch with a former student of ours who's been taking, and who's a teacher in schools now, but he's taking an outdoor survival course through the Department of Natural Resources. And he said every course, the instructors make racial slurs, and he has about Indigenous people here, and he has gone up and spoken to them twice now, and he has one more class left. And he's like, you know, if I didn't love being outdoors and doing these things, that he's trying to figure out who to write an official complaint to, because they're, you know, they sort of said, oh, well, we just get used to talking that way. That was their excuse. And it's just, you know, these are people representing the government.
Yeah.
So it's,
And it just continues to
They're adults.
normalize that
Yeah.
narrative,
Alan?
I just have a couple of comments about your quote from David Johnson in the speech from his throne.
Yeah.
One is, in my own PhD thesis, I examined 3 narratives that the federal government developed over years to as icons for focusing Canadian identity, and one was the land of the conquering pioneers. I'm going to send you a quote from Ellen Fairclough, who was a conservative cabinet minister in 1958. It's almost exactly the same as David Johnson's quote that illustrates this land of the conquering pioneers. But I did want to, in defense of David Johnson, it's actually, the throne speech is a statement of the government of Canada.
Yeah, the government writes it
Program.
for
So
you.
I think that carries even more force.
Yes, it does.
And in this government, therefore, it's a statement of the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And therefore completely consistent with his statement that Canada doesn't have a colonial past, right? So, and the other thing is, I'm wondering, can you share, have you published the kinds of quotes you showed us from grade 3 children? Because I'm just, Lyle and I are working on a paper now where we've been interviewing grade 6 children in New Brunswick who know nothing about these grade 6 children in New Brunswick who do not recognize the word malacy, who do not recognize the term First Nation, who don't use things like words like treaty and obligation. And so I would like this to contrast, not to shame us, but to say that teaching matters.
Yeah.
And that children can learn these things, right? Young children can learn these things and can talk about them in sophisticated ways. So I think in our work, when we see knowledge, it's almost never school knowledge. When the kids do have knowledge, they talk about it coming from my mother took me to a powwow, or I have a friend that lives in the St. Mary's community or something, so that the children have learned it in their own personal experience, but they haven't learned it at school. And so I think we need to emphasize that teaching matters, good programs matter. And so even when I'm at the point now where I would love the kind of trivial stuff you talked about, because we're not even seeing stuff like that, almost, right? So I don't know, have you published that?
We have submitted it to a journal, so it's under review. So we'll see. We sometimes get very mixed reviews of this.
I'm going to cite your conference paper tonight, but anyway. It was very powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I just want to say too that the teacher, Claire Kruger, who was involved in our research project, like she was just tremendous and really kind of took up the challenge, even though she didn't have the knowledge as she articulated. And so our research team nominated her for the Ken Spencer Award last year through the Canadian Educational Association, and she was a recipient. And so you can Google Ken Spencer Award 2014 and Claire Kruger.
They just sent me an announcement about it today.
They did, yeah. There's this year's winners have just been announced, but Claire's project is profiled on the Canadian Education Association website. And so that kind of acknowledgement, I think, is really powerful to share with other teachers too. So there is this work happening, and it is important, and people are recognizing the importance of the work.
Lisa and then Andrew.
Hi. Thanks, Jennifer, for speaking so eloquently as a non-native ally to these issues. I think that's really, it's very heartwarming for me to see somebody like yourself speaking so passionately on these issues. We need more of you in this country. I have a question about the process that's happening in your area in terms of rolling this out in the educational system. I wonder, like you're saying, the children, it's being implemented within the school system. But how are the process, I'm curious about, because I guess we do with this kind of here as well, is that, we expect our teachers to know how to teach this stuff, and they don't really have the content, the context at all.
I think that's an excellent question. So the Office of the Treaty Commissioner provides ongoing workshops for teachers throughout the province. They are mobile, they will go anywhere and provide some of those supports. And they have also embarked on a Treaty Catalyst teacher program, so like a Train the Trainer program. So now many school divisions have Treaty Catalyst teachers who can provide support for teachers that are wanting to but struggling with implementing treaty education. And a lot of our graduates in the last few years that take up teaching positions are becoming leaders in their schools because they do have the knowledge from our teacher education program, and they, I think, are understanding more fully the imperatives of the work. So that's happening as well. And then it varies. You know, I think there are some school divisions that are really deeply committed to the work, and there are others that just aren't as
It's not
committed.
consistent.
It is not consistent. It's not consistent at all. But I do want to say that the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, for their teaching treaties in the classroom resources, received the Canadian Race Relations Foundation Award of Excellence. And so all of the resources are available on their website if anyone is interested, www.otc.ca. And they are also bilingual, so they have resources in French as well. And they are working on free resources too.
We don't actually have an office of the treaty commissioner here, so that's a little tricky for us. Andrew?
My first question was, I was wondering if you're either fluent or have any extensive, like, knowing Maliseet. You were talking about, like, the number of treaties, like, whenever you named a treaty, you said a number next to it. Why was that?
The numbered treaties. So the treaties 1 through 10, we refer to as the numbered treaties, which were signed between the British government and different First Nations groups from Ontario all the way to Alberta. So those are the numbered treaties when I talk about Treaty 4 or Treaty 6. This part of the country is not covered by numbered treaties, but the peace and friendship agreements or treaties exist in Nova Scotia and...
Maybe we can push back to your slide.
Sure, yeah, good idea.
Because some were signed, Andrew, before Confederation.
Yeah.
And some were signed after Canada became a country.
Yeah.
After Confederation.
How are those treaties honored if, if there's no, like, an actual treaty put down there?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. They're not, some would argue they're not well honored.
You can see the green ones there, dear.
Yeah.
Those are the peace and friendship ones that this land is supposed to be recognized through. So they're 251 years old now, David? Is that right? And the government ignores it quite a bit.
Yeah.
If not always.
Although more recently, the Supreme Court has been ruling in favor of First Nations lawsuits against the government. So the Donald Marshall case comes to mind in Nova Scotia, where he was arrested for fishing without a license, and his argument was that it was his right and could be traced to the peace and friendship treaties agreements, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. And so I think we're seeing more of those kinds of examples. The treaty rights are enshrined in the Constitution as well, although, you know, many of my Cree and Soto colleagues would say that even though they're entrenched in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that they're enacted in practice. So
We did a little survey in my class this afternoon of 23 students, and we asked how many had learned about the Treaty of Versailles in school, and every student put up their hand.
Yeah.
Canada is not a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles. Only 4 had learned about the numbered treaties in school.
Yeah.
And Canada is a signatory to every one of the numbered treaties.
That's correct. Which is why Dr. Miller from the U of S says they're a paradox. It's a paradox because they're so foundationally important to the history of this country, but most Canadians know little or nothing at all about the numbered treaties. And I mean, I was one of those Canadians, and I am still learning about them. And I know a lot more about Treaty 4 than I know about Treaty 8, or that I even know about the peace and friendship agreements. And so there's a lot of learning that we have to do in an ongoing way. So books like John Ralston Saul's The Comeback is helpful because he does trace a lot of those earlier agreements, and also right back to the Royal Proclamation too, and the language of that document in terms of relationships with the First Peoples of the land. So he's got a lot of the archival information at the back of the book. I think it's a useful resource. I don't agree with everything he says in the book, but
That's okay.
Yeah.
What was the name that you said?
The Comeback,
Yes.
John Ralston Saul.
I want to start to draw this to a close because we're going to also be able to go downstairs to what's called the faculty lounge, room 225, There's a reception of some kind there. It's always a surprise. But there's some goodies there of some kind. And we hope you'll come down, and really want to thank you, Jennifer, for coming and doing this, for talking about such an important topic, and especially for helping us honor the memory of Ottilia in this way. Ottilia worked closely at St. X with a number of First Nations students and a number of First Nations programs where we were trying to get teacher education programs taught out in the First Nation communities. And it was one of her passions, as you know. And so I really want to thank you for coming today to talk about something that reminds us of her work as well. And just before we close, I want to invite Patricia to come up and say a couple of words to you on behalf of her sisters.
So with the reception coming up, I'll try to keep this very short. But as many of you know, Ottilia was a 3-time graduate of Faculty of Education at the University of New Brunswick. And it was after her death that the faculty decided to create this lecture series in her honor. I remember one of her greatest achievements while she was at UNB was receiving her PhD back in 2005. And for me, my fondest recollection of that time would be a picture of my family that was taken the day of the ceremony. And in it, 2 of my sisters and I are wearing mismatched clothing, the wind is blowing, hair is everywhere, and one sister forgot to smile. And when you look at it, in the midst of what seems like a crazy picture was Ottilia, who had rosy cheeks and a bright smile, somehow in the center of the picture, perfectly posed, looking as happy as can be, very proud of her achievement and her family's support. I want to thank everyone who aids in making this event possible every year, including speakers from previous years, and of course today's speaker, Dr. Jennifer Tupper. I'm very fortunate to have been able to attend this year. I know that me and my sisters sincerely appreciate events such as this. Since her passing, we've all tried to strive to follow in her footsteps of excellence, pursuing passions in business, law, engineering, and fitness and nutrition. So once again, I just wanted to thank everybody, and you know, things have been difficult for us since her passing, but through the support of all the people that have been around us, it's definitely made all the difference, whether the support has come from emotional support or financial support, to remembering birthdays or sending Christmas cards, to providing a roof over my head while I'm staying here, or just the simple generosity of taking me out to supper tonight. So on behalf of my sisters, I would just like to say thank you so much to everyone who's come out this evening.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Your mother would be very proud, is very proud of you, I know. So please join us downstairs. I do want to just point out one little thing. Jennifer talked about the project of Heart, and there were numerous projects of Heart that went on across Canada. And we're very fortunate to be able to display the beautiful sculpture that was made in this area in our lower lobby. In fact, Lisa and Stephen's son was part of it, part of the metal work that he did. It was largely organized by the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design. And it was the survivors of residential schools who painted the tiles that have been put together in a beautiful wampum belt that stands about 7 feet high, something like that. It's enormous. And it's downstairs in a large glass case. You can't miss it. It takes up the whole middle of the hallway. But I do invite you to have a little look downstairs. It's right at the front door. Even if you're going out the back door, have a little look down there to see what the project of Heart from this area looks like, because it's a really striking memorial to the people who survived residential schools. So thank you for reminding me to tell people about that. Again, thank you for coming out on a snowy night. Do stop by to grab a little treat, and we'll hope to see you the next time we are together. Thanks. Thank you.